Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, it's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. I'm on my way home after having gone into campus for a meeting. The birds are chirping, and I'm happy to be talking with you. Well, plenty to talk about, and I thought I would start with thinking a little bit about weird scoring conditions. What was it that made me think of this? So the other day, in my music shuffling, I was just listening to a variety of different tunes in my MP3 library. I happened across an old song from Moxie Fruvis, which is a Canadian, mostly a cappella band from the 90s. And they had a song they performed in their live album called Lowest Highest Point. It was like a trivia quiz for the audience. And they said, which state has the lowest highest point? And then they did a song, lowest highest point, etc., etc. And the idea was, it's just, which state do you think it is? It got me thinking that it might be interesting to talk about interesting scoring conditions. One of my favorite things about playing a new board game is discovering that it has an interesting scoring condition, something counterintuitive, something weird, something that makes you think about the game in a different way. You know, most games have uninteresting scoring conditions. Earn the most points being the most common one, have the most money being the second most common one, which is basically earn the most points. I thought that it would be interesting to explore 5 different interesting win conditions and talk a little bit about why I find them interesting and go from there. So to start with, I do want to acknowledge I did, in a quick glance at the Pick Up and Deliver pages, I believe that I did do one previous show where I talk about an issue sort of related to this, and that is, there's an episode I did called Currency as Points, where I was specifically talking about how I like when a game makes you think about spending your points to do things. Any game that uses money as the final score and you have to spend money to do stuff is already doing currency as points. But there are some games where you just have to give up points in order to do things. One example that came to mind was Small World, where you have to give up points in order to choose a different faction, or Gaia Project, where if you want to take a bonus from one of your opponents doing an advancement, you have to spend points to do that. And there's an interesting trade-off to think about, like getting a benefit in the game, but giving up some of your scoring edge to do so. And you know, I like that trade-off. We aren't talking about that today necessarily, but I did want to mention it. I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to go back and review that episode. It was a long time ago, but I thought I would talk about 5 different end game conditions or win conditions that I think are pretty cool and always make me interested in a game. The first one I want to talk about is sort of in its strongest mode in Cockroach Poker, but appears in a number of other modes as well in a slightly less dramatic way, and this is just one loser. Now in Cockroach Poker, there is no winner of the game. If you haven't played that game, it's a memory game where you're passing around cards and telling each other the cards are this or that. And if somebody incorrectly challenges those cards a certain number of times, they lose the game. When they lose the game, the game is over. One person lost, everybody else wins and can laugh at them. But there are a number of other games where when one person loses enough, that ends the game, and then the winner is the person who has the most points or most money or whatever. The example that I'm thinking of lately is That's Not a Hat, which if you've played Cockroach Poker and then you go play That's Not a Hat, you're like, oh, this is an iteration on this idea. It's a fun one, and I actually like That's Not a Hat better than Cockroach Poker, but they're very similar games in a lot of ways. But the idea of That's Not a Hat, again, when somebody loses enough to get a certain number of negative points, then the game ends and the person or people who have the fewest negative points win the game. I know that there are other games out there where the game ends when somebody loses and then we determine a winner. I can't think of any others off the top of my head, but I know there are others. So I would say that's an interesting win condition to me, is like the game ends when somebody loses. and then we determine a winner or not. All right, the second one I wanted to point to I like end game conditions where it's points, but the points come from making your own point choices. Now, on some minor games, the way this will work is something like in Coimbra or Shipyard, there will be end game scoring conditions that you're aiming for, and if you achieve those, then you get points. If you're playing Shipyard with the variant rule where all 5, instead of getting an individual scoring condition, which is more traditional in terms of scoring, instead there are 5 on the board and you can aim for one to resolve. That feels interesting to me. You are deciding on your own win condition. A more dramatic version of this is the card game Arboretum. In Arboretum, you're building a display of trees and you score the trees where you have the most trees in that number, I believe. If you have the most trees in a line of anyone else, then you get to score that kind of tree. You also have to have in your hand the highest value card of anyone else of that type of tree. So like if you want to score an oak tree, you have to have a line, the biggest line of oak trees in your park, but then you also have to have the highest value oak tree in order to score those things. You need both. As I recall, it's possible that you just score your line of oak trees if you have the highest number, but I think you have to have both. So there's an interesting element where you're trying to hold on to a really high number to screw your opponent out of scoring, and that's really fun. So if you haven't tried Arboretum, it's worth a try if you remember it is a ridiculously mean game. So make your own scoring. I also said Coimbra because in Coimbra there are a number of scoring conditions that you can activate by going around on the board, and so you kind of get to decide which ones you want to try to score. All right, next up, I wanted to mention bottom loser / top loser. And these are games that usually have some sort of win condition that's determined by points. And so there's not anything really special about that, except they usually also have a secondary rule where if you are the bottom loser or the top winner, then you don't win because you are the bottom loser or the top winner. And there are a couple different games I can think of like that. In high society, if you have spent the most money, you lose the game, even if you have the most points. So there's an element of you want to get the most points, but you don't want to spend the most money because then you're poor. And the whole thing of high society is you're not supposed to be poor. Similarly, in QE, if you spend the most money in that game, you also lose, and then you win if you have the most points after the person who spent the most money is eliminated. So both of those games turn on the idea of they're auction games, so you're trying to decide how much to spend, but if you spend too much, then you lose the game, even if you got the most points. And then there are games where there's a bottom loser as well. Sometimes it'll be the person with the lowest score in some secondary track is out. The best example of this, or my favorite example of this, is in A Study in Emerald. A Study in Emerald is an excellent Martin Wallace area control game where players are on one of 2 teams and you don't know who's on your team or not except by their actions and maybe what they say. And at the end of the game, everyone reveals their team, and then you look at the scoreboard. And whichever player on the board has the lowest score, everyone on their team is out of the game. And then the winner is the person with the highest score who wasn't on the team with the person who had the lowest score. It's a great and wild result that I really enjoy. So that's bottom loser / top loser. As an aside, it also strikes me one that I didn't mention that I do find a lot of fun are individual individual win conditions, where each player has their own thing they're trying to do and the game ends if one of them accomplishes it. The best example I can think of for that is Nanty Narking, but of course Root also has that element. Now in Root, you know what everybody's win condition is. In Nanty Narking, you know what all the possible win conditions are, but it's secret who has which one. So a part of the game is trying to figure out who's going for what and not let anybody achieve any of the win conditions because they might be going for that one. I'll call that an honorable mention, though it's not one of my 5. All right, so the last one is going to go back to a mystery I started at the beginning of the episode. Pay attention, friends. That's what you call narrative cohesion. It's going back to the idea of the lowest highest point. Now, there are two games I want to point to that have interesting lowest highest point mechanisms. The first is going to be Tigris and Euphrates, although this stands in for many Reiner Knizia games that do this and many other games that do the same thing, which is there are a variety of scoring conditions or ways that you can score different things. And at the end of the game, you look at those categories, and whichever category you've scored lowest in, that's the category that is actually your score. So in Tigris and Euphrates, you want to have as many points as you can in a lot of things, but as I recall, the one you scored worst in is the one that you score. Similarly, in the game Between Two Cities, you have two cities, and one of them will have one score and one will have another. Whichever score is lower, that is the score that you get to use as your score for the game. So there's an interesting balance there, where if your second city is the lower score for both you and your opponent, then you have a tie and you have to see who did better on your better city. But I really like that balance because the game forces you to try to keep them even. But I think the game, if I'm going to point to one game that I think has the most interesting win conditions, this is the game Lords of Zidit. Now, Lords of Zidit is a weird game. It is a programming game where you are arranging different adventurers and you're going around a map collecting different kinds of points. And there are 3 different ways that you can collect points, as I recall. I don't remember the specifics of each one, but there are 3 different ways you can collect points. You can put points in the wizard towers, you can earn points from saving cities, and there's one other way that you can earn points. But all 3 of these different point structures, you earn different amounts of them from different things you do, and you get some flexibility into like contributing them or whatever, but your goal is to look at them in a variety of ways, and the game has all 3 metrics in order. And what makes the game really interesting is that when you get to the end of the game, this is randomized which 3 is first, second, or third. When you get to the end of the game, we examine scoring condition 1 first, whichever of the 3 forms, and whomever has the worst score in that category is out of the running for winning the game. They're out of the game. Then we go on to category 2. We look at category 2. Whoever has the worst score of the remaining players in category 2 is out of running for winning the game. Then we go on to category 3. Of the remaining players, whoever has the best score wins the game. So that one is really the lowest highest point. What a fascinating score mechanism, and boy does it bend your brain when you're trying to decide where to put your energy, to the point that for some people it ends up being really hard to just figure out what you're supposed to be doing because it's so brain bendy. But it's really fun and I sure enjoy it. So Lords of Zidit, coolest scoring mechanism that I can point to today. So what games did I miss? What games would you add? What mechanisms would you add for cool scoring mechanisms to think about? These could be games where you win on having the most points, but I'd love to know what it is about specific sets of points that makes you think X, Y, or Z. Share your thoughts over on Board Game Geek and Guild 3269, or send me a message. Wombat929 is my username there. Brendan at Rattlebox Games is my email address. I'd love to hear from you to know what are your thoughts on these specific elements. Well, thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.